Have you ever felt that your brain simply doesn't have an off button? Understand how overthinking dominates the routine of those who think too much and discover strategies to regain control of your intelligent mind. In the United States and the fast-paced corporate world we live in today, being a highly analytical person is often seen as the ultimate key to success. But there is a hidden price that few people discuss openly. When you have a high cognitive capacity, the mind is constantly connecting dots, predicting the future, and analyzing every minute detail of the environment. It is fundamental to understand that this is not a manufacturing defect, but rather a side effect of a brilliant brain that works at high speed. The problem is that, without the proper break, this superpower turns into an exhausting prison. Overthinking starts silently in everyday life. It can be that half-hour reevaluation of a simple work email before clicking send, or the heavy insomnia that hits in the middle of the night because the mind decided to replay a common conversation that happened days ago. Living with overthinking, like trying to operate a computer with dozens of open browser tabs, all playing different videos at the same time. While society applauds the ability to solve complex problems, inside, this constant exhaustion drains vital energy. Understanding that overthinking is a byproduct of intelligence itself is the first major step to stop self-blame. But to truly disarm this trap, it is necessary to discover what triggers this continuous state of alert and how our own body reacts to it. To understand exactly what happens inside an accelerated mind, psychology and neuroscience offer fascinating answers about overthinking. When the brain processes information in an extremely detailed way, it frequently enters a state known as mental rumination. It is that phenomenon where a thought or worry keeps repeating in an infinite loop, consuming a massive amount of energy. Science demonstrates that, at the core of overthinking, there is a hyperactivation of the brain's alert system, responsible for identifying danger. Historically, predicting all possible threats was a matter of survival. But today, these threats have turned into unrealistic work goals, complex social interactions, or financial uncertainties, a direct reflection of the high-performance culture deeply rooted in the lifestyle of major American centers. The intelligent brain, in an attempt to guarantee protection, starts creating dozens of hypothetical scenarios, simulating the worst possible outcome for each situation. This unbridled search for cognitive safety generates what psychology calls analysis paralysis, where, instead of facilitating problem-solving, overthinking causes action to be halted in the face of excess variables. There is an unconscious belief that exhaustively analyzing a challenge will guarantee absolute control over the future. However, the reality is that this sense of control is just an illusion, because overthinking does not prevent unforeseen events. It only prevents the present moment from being lived. The mental energy that should be directed towards execution ends up being sucked away by overthinking, resulting in deep exhaustion. Understanding that this overload is a primitive defense mechanism operating in a modern mind helps to eliminate judgment. However, it is fundamental to observe how this invisible neurological manifests in practice, harming everything from daily focus to nights of sleep. In practice, the battlefield of this neuroscience happens in the small things of everyday life, where the silent symptoms of overthinking start to drain the mental battery even before the day truly begins. Imagine the scene of a professional waking up on a busy morning in New York, or in the fast-paced routine of Silicon Valley. The simple task of choosing appropriate clothes for the weather, or deciding the sugar level of coffee in the Starbucks line can trigger early exhaustion. This happens because overthinking rarely differentiates major choices from trivial decisions. Everything is processed with the same analytical intensity and emotional weight, generating a chronic state known as decision fatigue. The intelligent mind spends so much cognitive fuel mapping morning variables that, upon opening the laptop to work, the capacity for deep focus is already compromised. In addition to daytime tiredness, It is in social interactions that overthinking reveals itself to be most exhausting. A simple Zoom meeting, an email with an unexpected period, or a hallway conversation can turn into a psychological torment. While a person with a quieter mind ends the interaction as soon as it is over, the mind dominated by overthinking takes that conversation home. An exhaustive replay process of the dialogue begins, dissecting micro-expressions, adjusting imaginary tones of voice, and looking for flaws in things that have already happened. The anxiety generated by this habit creates an internal tribunal, where the person is constantly being judged and condemned for invisible mistakes. And when night falls, the true peak of overthinking usually happens. It is in the silence of the bedroom, when the body begs for rest and the city sleeps, that the brain decides to turn on the worry projector. The frequent insomnia of these brilliant minds comes not only from a physical imbalance, but from the inability to pull the handbrake on an overheated machine. At 2 in the morning, overthinking can bring up a small embarrassment that occurred 5 years ago, or start drawing all the catastrophic scenarios for a presentation next week. It is a lonely experience that turns intelligence into a source of pain. However, the exhaustion generated by these sleepless nights and days on high alert creates a dangerous domino effect in one's career and personal life. And understanding how this exhaustion feeds an invisible cycle of self-sabotage is essential to turning the game around. This domino effect inevitably leads to the painful cycle of self-sabotage and perfectionism, where overthinking takes its highest and most visible toll. When a brilliant mind is constantly exhausted by analyzing every little detail of the routine, making bigger decisions and taking action becomes a monumental task. There is an intimate and dangerous connection between overthinking, the relentless pursuit of perfection, and chronic procrastination. In the American culture of hustle and corporate hyperproductivity, failing publicly or making the wrong decision often feels like the end of the world. To avoid any possibility of making a mistake, the brain begins to demand that all variables are perfectly aligned and calculated before taking the first step. However, the brutal and inconvenient truth is that the perfect moment simply does not exist. And overthinking uses this search for unattainable perfection to keep the individual trapped in an illusory and stagnant comfort zone. What at first seems to be just a careful and logical analysis to accept a new career opportunity in Chicago, or a meticulous planning to start a tech project in Texas, quickly turns into an insurmountable mental trap. Overthinking begins to project so many imaginary scenarios of failure, calculating risks that often border on the absurd, that the real window of opportunity ends up closing while the decision is postponed. The intelligent mind, in a desperate and misguided attempt to protect itself against criticism, disappointment, or future pain, ends up sabotaging its own progress. This is exactly how great business ideas never leave the paper. And this is how promising connections are discarded even before they deepen. All because overthinking convinced reason that inaction and stagnation were the safest choices. Procrastination, analyzed from this psychological perspective, ceases to be seen as simple laziness and reveals itself as a strong, paralyzing defense mechanism against the roller coaster of anxiety generated by thinking too much all the time. This is the true price of having an analytical mind that doesn't turn off, watching life pass by through the constant lens of what if, while the fear of an unreal future robs the ability to take concrete actions in the present. Breaking this complex web of self-sabotage and fatigue requires much more than just willpower or passing motivation. It requires the application of practical methods to reprogram the way the brain deals with uncertainty and the fear of making mistakes. The excellent news is that, just as overthinking is a behavioral pattern reinforced by intelligence itself, it is perfectly possible to use this same high cognitive capacity to apply scientific strategies capable of silencing the internal chaos once and for all. The good news is that exactly the same intelligence that created this mental maze can be trained to build the exit, using effective psychological strategies to break overthinking definitively. The main goal here is not to try to forcibly turn off the brain, which besides being frustrating is physiologically impossible, but rather to learn to redirect all this analytical power. Cognitive behavioral therapy offers extremely practical tools for everyday life, and one of the most efficient is the so-called worry scheduling. Instead of allowing overthinking to consume your energy from the morning commute in Los Angeles traffic till bedtime, you literally schedule a time in your routine just to worry. It can be a 15-minute window, perhaps at 4 in the afternoon, where you have full permission to analyze the worst scenarios of a project or relive challenging conversations. When an anxious thought arises outside of this time, you simply write it down and tell your brain that you will deal with it later. This gives back control of your mental schedule and prevents overthinking from dictating the pace of your entire day. Another fundamental technique to tame a hyperactive mind is cognitive distancing. Analytical people tend to believe that every thought generated by overthinking is an absolute fact that needs immediate resolution. The practice consists of labeling the thought. Instead of internalizing the idea that a business presentation on Wall Street will be a complete disaster, you reframe it to the following structure. I am having the thought that the presentation will be a disaster. This subtle change in language creates a vital space between the individual and anxiety, allowing intelligence to observe overthinking as a passing process and not as an unquestionable truth. It is like watching cars pass by on a busy highway, instead of trying to jump in front of each one of them to stop the traffic. Finally, when overthinking reaches that paralyzing peak of anxiety, the grounding technique in the present moment acts as an emergency brake for the nervous system. Since overthinking lives exclusively in the regret of the past or in the fear of a catastrophic future, forcing the brain to focus on the now breaks the cycle instantly. Engaging the physical senses, whether by paying absolute attention to the temperature and texture of your coffee cup, identifying specific sounds around you, or simply controlling the flow of your own breathing, pulls the mind back to concrete reality. By consistently applying these strategies, high cognitive capacity ceases to be an exhaustion machine and returns to being the main problem-solving tool for everyday life. And understanding how to consolidate these new tools in your long-term routine is the final and definitive step to ensure that your brain works in your favor and not against you. Regaining control of your intelligent mind does not mean turning off your capacity to think deeply, but rather learning to focus that energy where it really matters. When you master overthinking, your intelligence stops being a source of constant exhaustion and goes back to being your greatest competitive advantage, whether in building a solid career or in the search for quality of life. True power lies in recognizing the triggers of overthinking and applying the correct strategies before anxiety takes over your day. If you identified with this daily battle against your own mind and want to continue receiving psychology-based strategies for your development, subscribe to the channel right now. Leave a comment down below telling which situation in your everyday life triggers overthinking the most in your routine.